Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. Sometimes the safest prison is the one your family builds for you. The crystal chandeliers above the Hawthorne estate reflected a perfection that felt colder than winter itself. Every polished marble floor, every priceless painting, every smiling guest had been carefully arranged for one purpose: to celebrate an engagement that Declan Hawthorne never wanted. At just 31 years old, he had built one of America's fastest-growing investment companies into a multi-billion-dollar empire, yet somehow the most important decision of his life had already been made without him. Tomorrow evening, he would announce his engagement to Victoria Ashford, the daughter of another billionaire dynasty, sealing a merger that Wall Street had been predicting for months. Reporters called it the wedding of the decade. Investors called it the smartest business move in years. His parents called it destiny. Declan called it surrender. He stood alone on the balcony overlooking Manhattan, the city glowing beneath him like an ocean of scattered diamonds. From inside the ballroom came the sound of elegant laughter, champagne glasses clinking together, and conversations about markets, politics, and legacy. None of it reached his heart anymore. His father stepped outside, adjusting the cuff of his tailored tuxedo with the same precision he used to negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions. "Tomorrow changes everything," he said calmly. "It changes the company," Declan answered without turning around. "Not my life." His father smiled as though speaking to a stubborn child. "Your life has always belonged to this family." Those words settled heavier than the cold February air. Declan had spent years convincing himself that success would eventually earn him freedom. Instead, every achievement had tightened the invisible chains around him. More companies, more expectations, more obligations, less choice, less peace, less himself. Minutes later, he walked away from the mansion before anyone noticed. No security detail, no chauffeur, just a dark SUV and an empty highway stretching north through the quiet outskirts of the city. He drove without destination, letting the miles silence the voices that had followed him his entire life. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the windshield, and somewhere after midnight, he stopped beside a small roadside diner, glowing beneath a faded neon sign. It was the kind of place where truck drivers drank coffee at impossible hours and nobody cared about family names or stock prices. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee mixed with warm apple pie. A tired waitress greeted him with a polite smile before returning to another table. In the far corner, a young woman struggled to gather several grocery bags that had split across the floor. Cans rolled beneath chairs. Bread slid toward the entrance. A carton of eggs teetered dangerously before stopping against his shoe. Without thinking, Declan bent down and picked it up. "Looks like the eggs survived," he said quietly. The young woman laughed despite herself, brushing a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "They're tougher than they look." Her smile wasn't practiced. It wasn't impressed by expensive watches or tailored coats. In fact, she hadn't even noticed either one. Together they gathered the groceries until everything fit inside the worn canvas bags again. "Thank you," she said. "Most people would have just walked around the mess. Most people probably had somewhere important to be. And you don't?" she asked. Declan glanced toward the snow-covered parking lot before answering. "Not anymore." She introduced herself as Elena Whitmore. Her coat was old, her boots had clearly seen better winters, and yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that didn't match the struggles written across her belongings. They shared coffee at the counter, talking about ordinary things neither had discussed in years. She spoke about juggling multiple jobs just to keep rent paid. He simply said he worked in finance. She admitted she dreamed of living a life where every decision wasn't controlled by money. He almost laughed at the irony because every decision in his life had been controlled by far too much of it. For the first time in months, conversation came easily. No hidden agendas, no negotiations, no expectations, just two strangers escaping lonely nights. Then Declan's phone vibrated. 23 missed calls. A message from his father appeared across the screen. "If you walk away tomorrow, you walk away from this family forever." Declan stared at the words before slowly locking the phone. He looked back at Elena, who was carefully stirring cream into her coffee without realizing she had just become the answer to a question he hadn't known how to solve. The silence stretched between them before he finally spoke, 4 words that neither of them would ever forget. Will you marry me? Elena froze with her coffee cup still resting between her hands, convinced she had misunderstood him. She studied Declan's face, expecting a smile or a quiet laugh that would reveal the question had been nothing more than an awkward joke. Instead, his expression remained calm, almost painfully sincere. You cannot possibly be serious, she whispered. I know how impossible it sounds, he answered. But I have a reason. Elena leaned back slightly, folding her arms. People do not ask strangers to get married over coffee. Most people do not have my problem. She shook her head slowly. Then tell me your problem. Declan hesitated. For years he had mastered the art of revealing only enough truth to satisfy investors, reporters, and board members without exposing anything real. Yet sitting across from Elena felt strangely different. My family has already planned my future, he admitted. Tomorrow I am expected to announce an engagement that has nothing to do with love. Elena listened without interrupting. If I refuse, I lose everything that has defined my life. She looked at him carefully before asking the question that mattered most. If you have that much to lose, why ask someone like me? Declan answered honestly. Because you are someone they would never choose. Which means the decision would finally be mine. Silence settled between them as snow continued falling outside the diner windows. Elena lowered her eyes toward the chipped ceramic mug in front of her. You still do not know anything about me. I know enough to believe you are kind. She almost smiled. Kindness does not make someone a good wife. No, Declan replied softly. But honesty makes someone a good partner, even if it is temporary. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a plain leather notebook instead of a legal contract. Tearing out a blank page, he borrowed a pen from the waitress and began writing. His handwriting was neat and deliberate. 1 year. Complete financial independence after the agreement ends. No expectation of romance. No interference with your future. Freedom to leave after 12 months. When he finished, he slid the paper across the counter. These are not legal terms, he said. They are promises before any lawyers become involved. Elena read every line twice before looking back at him. You forgot one condition. Which one? Mutual respect. Without hesitation, Declan took the paper back and added 2 more words beneath the others. Mutual respect. He signed his name first before handing her the pen. She noticed he had written only Declan, without a last name. That seemed oddly humble for a man who carried himself with quiet confidence. Elena did not sign immediately. Instead, she reached beneath the collar of her sweater and gently touched the small silver pendant she always wore. It was old, scratched, and attached to a delicate chain that looked as though it had been repaired more than once. She had worn it for as long as she could remember. Her fingers rested on it whenever life demanded impossible choices. Declan noticed the gesture but asked no questions. Some stories deserve patience. If I say yes, Elena finally said, there has to be honesty between us. Maybe not every secret on the first day, but no lies that would destroy trust later. Declan felt those words settle deeply inside him. They sounded simple, yet he already knew he could not completely fulfill them. There were truths about his family, his company, and even his name that would have to wait. Still, he nodded. You have my word that I will never intentionally humiliate you or treat you like a business transaction. Elena looked out at the quiet highway before closing her eyes for a brief moment. Rent was overdue. Her second job had reduced her hours. Every month felt like another uphill climb with no clear destination. This offer sounded unbelievable, perhaps even reckless, but the man sitting across from her had shown nothing except patience and respect since the moment they met. She slowly signed the page with a steady hand. Declan folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside the notebook. Neither of them realized that an elderly customer seated near the window had quietly watched the entire conversation with unusual interest before leaving the diner without finishing his pie. As the waitress returned to refill their coffee, she smiled warmly and said, You two look like you have just made a life-changing decision. Elena and Declan exchanged uncertain glances. Neither of them could explain why those simple words suddenly felt far more real than either of them was ready to admit. The sun had barely risen when Declan guided his SUV through the wrought iron gates of the Hawthorne estate. Elena stared silently through the passenger window as the mansion came into view, its limestone walls glowing beneath the soft morning light. The home looked less like a residence and more like a private museum, surrounded by perfectly trimmed gardens, fountains, and towering oak trees that had probably stood there for generations. She tightened her grip on the canvas bag resting in her lap. Everything she owned fit inside it. Declan noticed, but said nothing. He simply parked near the front entrance before turning toward her. From this moment forward, cameras may appear without warning. My family will ask difficult questions. You do not have to impress anyone. Just be yourself. Elena gave a small nod. That sounds easier than it probably is. Before either of them stepped out, the enormous front doors opened. A line of household staff stood waiting with practiced smiles, but the warmth ended there. Standing at the top of the marble staircase was Evelyn Hawthorne, elegant in a cream-colored suit, her posture flawless and her expression unreadable. Beside her stood Charles Hawthorne, whose sharp eyes immediately settled on Elena with quiet calculation. Neither parent greeted their son first. Evelyn spoke directly to Elena. "Welcome." The single word sounded polite, yet carried the weight of careful judgment. Elena answered with calm confidence. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Hawthorne." Evelyn's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. Most people stumbled under her gaze. Elena did not. Inside the grand foyer, fresh flowers filled crystal vases while priceless artwork lined the walls. Every detail reflected generations of wealth. Declan expected Elena to appear overwhelmed, but instead she paused briefly in front of an antique grandfather clock. "Late 18th century," she said softly. "Beautiful restoration work." Charles looked genuinely surprised. "You recognize it?" Elena smiled politely. "Someone repaired the pendulum housing by hand. It is almost impossible to notice unless you look closely." Charles glanced toward the clock before quietly examining it himself. She was correct. Declan watched the exchange with growing curiosity. A woman working multiple jobs to survive should not have recognized craftsmanship that even many collectors overlooked. Before he could ask anything, another voice interrupted. "So this is the mystery bride." Victoria Ashford entered the room wearing a perfectly tailored navy dress and an effortless smile that never reached her eyes. She walked confidently toward Elena before slowly looking her up and down. "You certainly arrived, unexpectedly." Elena returned the smile without changing her posture. "Life usually does." Victoria laughed softly, though there was no humor behind it. "I imagine adjusting to this world will take some time." Elena answered with the same gentle composure. "Every world has people. That part usually stays the same." For the first time, Victoria had no immediate reply. Declan noticed several staff members exchange subtle glances. They had expected embarrassment. Instead, they witnessed quiet grace. Throughout breakfast, the questions continued. Where had Elena grown up? What schools had she attended? What did her parents do? Elena answered honestly whenever she could while politely declining subjects. Connected to her childhood before the age of 8. "I simply do not remember much from those years," she explained. Her answer was truthful, though incomplete. Beneath the table, her fingers briefly touched the silver pendant resting against her sweater before releasing it again. Declan noticed the familiar gesture. It appeared whenever conversation drifted toward her past. After breakfast, Evelyn requested that Elena accompany her through the house. As they walked from room to room, Evelyn intentionally pointed out paintings, sculptures, and family heirlooms, quietly expecting the young woman to reveal ignorance or insecurity. Instead, Elena admired each piece with genuine appreciation rather than forced admiration. She never pretended to know what she did not, yet when she recognized something, she spoke with surprising confidence. In the estate library, she paused before an old leather-bound volume resting inside a glass display case. "That edition should not be near direct sunlight," she said gently. "The binding could fade over time." Evelyn turned toward the nearby windows, noticing the morning light reaching the case exactly as Elena described. She said nothing, but the smallest crack appeared in her certainty. That afternoon, as Declan stood alone in his office overlooking the gardens, he found himself thinking less about the contract they had signed and more about the woman who seemed completely out of place while somehow belonging everywhere she stood. The questions surrounding Elena Whitmore were multiplying much faster than the answers, and somewhere deep inside the mansion, someone else had already begun searching for the truth hidden behind the small silver pendant she never took off. The following week unfolded with surprising calm. almost as if the enormous mansion itself had accepted an agreement that everyone inside continued to question. Every morning, Declan left early for meetings while Elena quietly settled into a routine that required no instruction. She greeted every employee by name after hearing it only once, thanked the kitchen staff after every meal, and insisted on carrying her own dishes despite repeated offers to help. At first, the employees assumed she was trying to impress the family, but after several days they realized this was simply who she was. Nothing about her kindness felt rehearsed. One rainy afternoon, Declan returned from the office earlier than expected after a difficult board meeting that had stretched for hours. The estate was unusually quiet until the faint sound of music drifted from the kitchen. Curious, he followed it and stopped just outside the doorway. Elena stood beside the large marble island wearing a simple apron over her sweater while one of the older cooks patiently showed her how to prepare homemade chicken noodle soup from a family recipe that had been served in the Hawthorne household for decades. They laughed together after Elena accidentally sprinkled too much parsley into the pot. When she noticed Declan standing nearby, she smiled without embarrassment. "You are home early," she said. "I was told this soup makes difficult days a little easier." Declan looked toward the elderly cook, who quietly excused herself with a knowing smile before leaving the kitchen. "You did not have to do this," he said. "I know," Elena replied as she gently stirred the soup. "Sometimes people need something because nobody expects it." They shared dinner in the breakfast room instead of the formal dining hall. There were no expensive wines, no business discussions, and no carefully planned conversations. They simply talked about favorite childhood meals, memorable road trips, and places they hoped to visit one day. Declan could not remember the last time he had laughed during dinner inside his own home. The contract resting inside his office drawer suddenly felt much smaller than the moments unfolding naturally between them. Over the next several days, those moments quietly multiplied. Elena helped one of the gardeners rescue delicate flowers before an unexpected frost. She spent an afternoon reading stories to the housekeeper's granddaughter while the child waited for her mother to finish work. She even convinced Declan to take a walk through the estate grounds instead of answering electronic mail late into another evening. As they crossed a stone bridge overlooking the small lake behind the mansion, Declan admitted something he had never told anyone outside his closest advisors. "When I was 18, I thought becoming successful would buy me freedom." Elena looked across the still water before answering. "Did it?" He smiled faintly. "It bought responsibilities I never imagined." She nodded with quiet understanding. "Money solves many problems. It just does not solve loneliness." Her words stayed with him long after they returned inside. One evening, Declan developed a severe headache after spending nearly 12 straight hours reviewing acquisition documents. Elena found him sitting alone in the library with unopened files scattered across the desk. Without making a speech or asking unnecessary questions, she disappeared for a few minutes before returning with warm tea, a small plate of fresh fruit, and a folded blanket from the nearby sitting room. "The documents will still be here tomorrow," she said gently. "You might not think clearly if you keep pushing yourself tonight." Declan accepted the tea, surprised by how naturally her concern reached him. No board member had ever told him to rest. No investor had ever asked whether he had eaten. Success had surrounded him with people who needed his decisions, but very few who noticed the person making them. As Elena gathered the empty teacup later that night, a folded envelope slipped from the pocket of her canvas bag onto the hardwood floor. She quickly bent down and picked it up before he could read more than a few faded handwritten lines on the front. The paper looked old, the edges softened by time, and a wax seal had long since broken away. Their eyes met for a brief moment. "It is nothing important," she said softly, carefully returning the letter to her bag. Declan did not challenge her answer. He simply nodded because trust, once questioned too soon, could disappear just as quickly as it had begun. Yet after she quietly left the library, he found himself wondering why the confident woman who faced billionaires without fear had looked unexpectedly vulnerable while holding a single worn envelope that seemed to carry the weight of an entire forgotten past. By the end of the second week, the headlines had finally caught up with reality. Every business network, entertainment program, and financial newspaper featured the same photograph of Declan and Elena leaving a charity luncheon together. The questions spread even faster than the pictures. Who was Elena Whitmore? Where had she come from? Why had one of the country's most eligible billionaires abandoned a carefully planned engagement to marry an unknown woman? The speculation became louder each day until one morning a popular celebrity magazine published an anonymous story claiming Elena had deliberately targeted wealthy men to escape poverty. The article offered no evidence, only rumors dressed as facts, but that was enough for social media to explode with judgment. By lunchtime, several television commentators openly questioned whether Declan had jeopardized the reputation of Hawthorne Capital for a relationship built on manipulation. Inside company headquarters, the atmosphere felt unusually tense. Members of the board gathered around the polished conference table while financial analysts displayed market data on enormous screens. Charles Hawthorne remained silent until everyone had taken a seat. Then one director cleared his throat. Our investors are becoming concerned. They believe the recent publicity could damage confidence in future acquisitions. Another executive added, several partners are already asking whether this marriage reflects instability in leadership. Declan listened without interrupting. Finally, one elderly board member leaned forward. There is still time to correct the situation. A formal separation would reassure the market. The room fell completely silent. Declan slowly closed the folder in front of him before looking around the table. You are discussing my wife as though she were a line item on a balance sheet. No one answered. She is not responsible for rumors created by people who have never spoken to her. One director attempted to remain diplomatic. This is simply business. Declan met his gaze without hesitation. No, this is character. There is a difference. At that same moment, Elena quietly shopped for groceries at a neighborhood market she had visited long before meeting Declan. She preferred going alone because the familiar surroundings reminded her that not everything in life had changed. As she reached for a loaf of bread, two strangers recognized her from the news. They whispered to each other before one finally spoke loud enough for others to hear. It must be nice marrying a billionaire instead of working for a living. Elena looked at the woman with calm eyes and answered gently. Everyone has a story that cannot be understood from a photograph. She paid for her groceries without another word and walked outside. Although she kept her composure, the quiet remarks followed her all the way home. That evening, she found Declan standing on the back terrace overlooking the gardens. He had already heard what happened from one of the security officers assigned to protect the estate. I am sorry, he said. None of this should have reached you. Elena set the grocery bags on a nearby bench before answering. People are free to believe whatever they want. I cannot control that. Declan looked directly at her. But I can choose what I stand for. Before she could respond, his phone rang. The caller was the communications director for Hawthorne Capital. Every major news network had requested an official statement. Investors wanted reassurance before markets opened the following morning. Declan ended the call after only a few moments. They expect me to distance myself from you, he admitted quietly. Elena lowered her eyes for a brief second before forcing a small smile. If that protects your company, I will understand. Declan stepped closer, his voice calm but unwavering. I asked you to trust me when we signed that piece of paper in the diner. I intend to deserve that trust. Early the next morning, dozens of reporters gathered outside company headquarters expecting a carefully written corporate statement. Instead, Declan walked directly to the entrance with Elena beside him. Camera shutters echoed across the plaza as questions came from every direction. He raised one hand, waiting until the crowd became quiet. There have been many stories written about my wife by people who have never taken the time to know her, he said. Let me make something perfectly clear. Elena Whitmore deserves the same respect as every other human being. She will not be judged by rumors while I remain silent. If anyone has concerns about my leadership, speak to me. Leave her out of it. For several seconds, no one asked another question. Standing beside him, Elena looked at him with quiet surprise because, for the first time since they had met, his words sounded nothing like an obligation created by a contract. They sounded like the promise of a man who had already begun protecting something far more valuable than his own reputation. 3 days after Declan defended Elena in front of the entire country, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Hawthorne estate just after sunrise. The house staff announced only that an elderly attorney insisted the meeting could not wait another day. His name was Arthur Bennett, a retired estate lawyer whose reputation had once been known among the oldest financial families in New York. Time had bent his shoulders, but not his posture, and the worn leather briefcase in his hand looked as though it had traveled through decades of history. Charles Hawthorne reluctantly agreed to receive him in the estate library, assuming the visit involved some forgotten legal matter. Declan entered moments later, followed by Elena, who had been helping the gardener trim early spring roses when she received the message. The moment Arthur Bennett looked at Elena, his expression changed completely. His eyes filled with quiet disbelief before settling on the small silver pendant resting against her sweater. He took one slow step forward. "May I ask where you got that necklace?" Elena instinctively placed her hand over the pendant. "I have worn it for as long as I can remember. It was already around my neck when I was taken into foster care." Arthur closed his eyes briefly, as though confirming a memory he had carried for many years. He carefully opened his briefcase and removed a thick collection of aged documents tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The top page displayed an elegant family crest that none of the younger members of the Hawthorne family immediately recognized. Declan watched as the attorney unfolded a yellowed photograph taken more than 2 decades earlier. It showed a smiling couple holding a little girl with light blonde hair. Around the child's neck hung the exact same silver pendant. Arthur placed the photograph beside Elena. "This family was once among the founders of Whitmore National Bank," he said quietly. "Their daughter disappeared after a tragic accident that left no surviving witnesses able to explain what happened." Elena stared at the picture without speaking. Her fingertips trembled slightly as she compared the pendant in the photograph with the one she had worn her entire life. Arthur then reached for another envelope sealed inside protective plastic. "For 20 years I searched under instructions left by your grandfather. If the child was ever found, these records were to be delivered only to her." Charles frowned. "Surely you are not suggesting?" Arthur interrupted with unusual confidence. "I am not suggesting anything. I am presenting evidence." He carefully spread birth certificates, trust documents, family records, and handwritten letters across the large oak table. Every signature had been notarized. Every date matched official archives. One final document contained a detailed description of a custom pendant commissioned by the Whitmore family jeweler, including an engraving hidden beneath the clasp. Arthur gently asked Elena for permission to examine the necklace. She slowly removed it and handed it to him. Using a small magnifying glass from his briefcase, he opened the delicate clasp. Inside, almost invisible to the naked eye, appeared 2 engraved initials surrounded by an intricate family crest. Elena covered her mouth in complete silence. Declan stepped closer, unable to look away. Arthur nodded softly. "There is no reasonable doubt. You are Elena Whitmore, the last direct heir of the Whitmore family." The room remained perfectly still. Even Evelyn Hawthorne, who had questioned Elena from the beginning, seemed unable to speak. Elena looked from the documents to the photograph before quietly asking, "If this is true, why did nobody ever find me?" Arthur lowered his eyes. "Someone worked very hard to ensure your identity disappeared. Records were altered, inquiries were blocked, and every trail ended before reaching the truth. I spent years following fragments that always seemed to vanish." He then handed Elena the worn envelope that matched the one Declan had briefly seen days earlier. "This letter belonged to your grandfather. It was recovered only recently from secure storage after a probate review uncovered files believed to have been lost." Elena carefully unfolded the fragile pages. Although tears gathered in her eyes, she remained composed as she silently read words written by a man she had never truly known. Declan did not ask what the letter said. He simply stood beside her, understanding that some moments deserved complete silence. Yet as Arthur Bennett quietly gathered the remaining documents into careful order, he delivered one final sentence that changed the atmosphere inside the library forever. "Finding Miss Whitmore answers one mystery," he said, "but discovering who benefited from her disappearance will uncover another, and I believe that truth is much closer to this family than any of us expected." The revelation spread through the Hawthorne estate faster than any business announcement in its history. By evening, every family attorney had arrived, every confidential archive had been opened, and every forgotten agreement connecting the Hawthorne and Whitmore families had been pulled from secure storage. Declan spent hours beside Arthur Bennett reviewing documents that stretched back nearly 30 years. At first, the records appeared ordinary, filled with merger proposals, charitable foundations, and investment partnerships. Then one contract caught Arthur's attention. It had been drafted only 6 months after Elena disappeared. The agreement outlined a proposed alliance between Hawthorne Capital and the remaining Whitmore holdings, contingent upon one extraordinary condition. If no surviving Whitmore heir could be legally identified, control of several trust assets would gradually transfer into the management of outside corporate partners. Arthur slowly removed his glasses and looked across the table. Someone expected the Whitmore family line to disappear permanently. Charles Hawthorne frowned as he read the document himself. This agreement never came through my office. Arthur nodded. Which means it may have been negotiated privately. Declan continued searching until another familiar name appeared near the signatures. His expression hardened. The document had been witnessed by Gregory Hawthorne, Charles's older brother and Declan's uncle, a man who had quietly retired from corporate life years earlier while maintaining influence behind the scenes through private investment companies. Declan looked toward his father. Why was Uncle Gregory involved with Whitmore assets? Charles remained silent for several seconds before answering honestly. He handled many external negotiations during that period. I trusted him completely. Arthur placed several additional files beside the contract. Together, they revealed a troubling pattern. Requests for updated birth records had been blocked. Probate investigations had repeatedly stalled. Anonymous legal objections had delayed every attempt to locate surviving Whitmore heirs. None of the evidence proved criminal conduct, but all of it pointed towards someone with significant financial resources and extraordinary access. Meanwhile, Elena sat alone in the estate library reading the letter from her grandfather for the third time. The words were filled not with instructions about wealth, but with hopes for the kind of woman he prayed she would become. He wrote that character would always outlast fortune and that kindness was the only inheritance nobody could steal. Tears quietly filled her eyes, not because of the fortune she had unknowingly lost, but because she had finally heard the voice of family after believing for most of her life that she had none. Declan entered the room carrying a folder of copied documents. He stopped before speaking. I wish I had better news. Elena gently folded the letter and looked up. You found something. He nodded. Enough to know your disappearance benefited someone. Not enough to prove exactly who planned it. She accepted the folder but closed it without reading. Do you think your family had something to do with it? The question hung heavily between them. Declan answered with complete honesty. I do not believe my parents knew, but I cannot ignore what the documents are showing about my uncle. Elena looked toward the fireplace, where the flames moved quietly behind the glass. When I was younger, I used to imagine someone would come looking for me one day. Eventually, I stopped believing it. Declan stepped closer. Someone did keep looking. Arthur never gave up. She smiled faintly. And somehow I found you first. Before either of them could say another word, the estate security director entered carrying a sealed envelope that had just been delivered by courier. It contained only a single sheet of paper with no signature. Across the center, typed in plain black letters, appeared one sentence. Stop searching before old mistakes become new tragedies. The room fell silent as Declan finished reading. He calmly folded the page before handing it to Arthur, who examined the paper with practiced eyes. This is not the act of someone confident their secrets will remain hidden, the attorney said quietly. This is the act of someone afraid the truth is finally catching up. Declan looked toward Elena with steady determination. The contract that had once brought them together no longer mattered. The fortune waiting under her family name no longer mattered either. What mattered now was ensuring that the woman who had spent most of her life searching for her past would finally receive every answer she deserved, no matter whose carefully protected legacy those answers might destroy. The anonymous warning did not slow the investigation. Instead, it strengthened everyone's resolve to uncover the truth. Over the following week, Arthur Bennett worked alongside independent legal experts, historians, and financial auditors, carefully reconstructing decades of forgotten records. Piece by piece, the missing history finally emerged. Gregory Hawthorne had quietly built a network of shell companies that positioned themselves to benefit if the Whitmore family line disappeared. Although no document directly proved he had orchestrated Elena's disappearance as a child, the financial trail revealed that he had spent years protecting the illusion that no rightful Whitmore heir remained. Every delay, every hidden file, every unexplained legal objection had served one purpose: preserving control over assets that never belonged to him. When the evidence was finally presented before the Hawthorne family and their legal advisors, Gregory denied every accusation. He insisted that every decision had been made to protect business stability during a chaotic period. Arthur calmly responded by placing one document after another onto the conference table until the explanations collapsed beneath the weight of undeniable facts. Gregory eventually lowered his eyes, offering no further defense. Charles Hawthorne remained silent for a long moment before speaking with visible disappointment. Our family's name was built on trust. Whatever was done in pursuit of wealth was never done with my knowledge, and it will not continue under my leadership. Within days, Gregory resigned from every remaining corporate position, and independent authorities began reviewing the financial records connected to the disputed trusts. As the legal process moved forward, another meeting was scheduled, this time involving the Whitmore estate. Arthur explained that Elena was now entitled to inherit an extraordinary fortune, historic properties, charitable foundations, and controlling interests in several long-standing financial institutions. The documents waiting before her represented more wealth than she had ever imagined possible. Everyone in the room expected celebration. Instead, Elena quietly looked through the pages before gently closing the folder. "I spent most of my life believing I had nothing," she said softly. "Yet the happiest moments I have experienced were never connected to money." Arthur looked at her with quiet respect. "What are you saying?" Elena smiled gently. "Restore everything that legally belongs to the Whitmore family. Honor every charitable promise my grandparents created. Protect the employees who depend on these companies. But I do not want my life to revolve around inherited wealth." The room became perfectly still. Even the attorneys exchanged surprised glances. Declan studied her face before asking, "Are you certain?" She nodded. "I finally found my family's history. That is the inheritance I needed most." Arthur carefully explained that she could establish an independent trust allowing professional managers to oversee the assets while directing most future income toward education, community banking initiatives, and scholarships honoring her grandparents. Elena agreed immediately. She wanted the Whitmore legacy to help ordinary families build better futures rather than become another symbol of privilege. Later that evening, Declan stood alone in his office holding the original one-year agreement they had signed in the roadside diner. The paper suddenly looked almost unreal compared with everything they had experienced together. Without hesitation, he carried it downstairs, where Elena was sitting near the library fireplace reading her grandfather's letter once again. He placed the folded agreement on the table between them. "This document gave me an escape when I believed my future belonged to everyone except me," he said quietly. "Now it no longer reflects the truth." Elena looked at the familiar sheet of paper before raising her eyes to meet his. "Because the investigation is over?" He slowly shook his head. "Because somewhere along the way I stopped pretending." His voice remained calm, yet every word carried complete sincerity. "You were supposed to help me avoid a life chosen by someone else. Instead, you showed me how to choose one for myself." Elena smiled through quiet emotion. "I thought I was the one who needed saving." Declan gently picked up the agreement and tore it cleanly into several pieces before placing them into the fireplace. They watched together as the flames slowly transformed the paper into drifting ash. No dramatic speeches followed. No promises were demanded. The silence itself carried more meaning than any contract ever could. For the first time since they met in that quiet roadside diner, there were no conditions left between them, no expiration date waiting on a calendar, and no invisible bargain shaping their future. There were only two people who had entered each other's lives through necessity and had quietly discovered that the greatest fortune either of them would ever receive could never be measured by a balance sheet. 1 year passed more quickly than either of them could have imagined. Spring returned to New York, carrying the same gentle breeze that had filled the air on the morning Elena first walked through the gates of the Hawthorne estate, with nothing more than a canvas bag and a quiet determination to honor an impossible agreement. So much had changed that the memories almost felt borrowed from another lifetime. The Whitmore Legacy Foundation had officially reopened under Elena's direction, providing scholarships for first-generation college students, affordable business loans for local entrepreneurs, and financial education programs for families who had never believed such opportunities could belong to them. Instead of becoming another billionaire hidden behind locked gates, Elena insisted on visiting every community the foundation supported. She remembered exactly what it felt like to wonder whether anyone noticed people who struggled quietly, and she refused to let others experience that same loneliness. Declan watched her transform every room she entered, not through power or wealth, but through genuine compassion. Hawthorne Capital also changed. Under Declan's leadership, the company introduced stronger transparency policies, expanded employee ownership programs, and strengthened ethical oversight throughout every division. Investors initially questioned those decisions, but the company grew stronger than ever because trust proved to be a more valuable investment than fear. Charles Hawthorne often admitted that his son had become the kind of leader he himself had spent decades trying to become. Even Evelyn, once guarded and skeptical, gradually formed a sincere bond with Elena after seeing the consistency of her character through countless ordinary moments rather than dramatic headlines. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Declan invited Elena to take a drive without telling her where they were going. Nearly an hour later, they arrived at the same small roadside diner where everything had begun. The faded neon sign had been restored, the booths had been reupholstered, and the elderly waitress who had served them that snowy night immediately recognized them. Smiling warmly, she poured 2 cups of coffee before saying, "I had a feeling the two of you would come back someday." They laughed together before sitting in the very same booth, where an impossible conversation had once changed both of their lives forever. After finishing their coffee, Declan suggested one last walk before heading home. They crossed the quiet parking lot toward the place where snow had once covered the ground and uncertainty had filled every heartbeat. This time spring flowers bordered the roadside, and sunlight stretched across the open fields beyond the highway. Declan stopped beneath a large oak tree and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Elena smiled knowingly when he removed another folded sheet of paper. "Please tell me that is not another contract," she teased. He laughed softly before unfolding the page. It was the original handwritten list of promises they had created together in the diner, preserved after he had secretly copied it before burning the official agreement months earlier. Beneath every promise appeared a handwritten check mark. Mutual respect. Kept. Honesty. Learned. Freedom. Shared. At the bottom of the page, he had added one final line in fresh ink. Forever. He looked into Elena's eyes with complete certainty before carefully folding the paper one final time. Then he slipped it back into his pocket and slowly knelt before her. "The first time I asked you to marry me, I was trying to escape a future someone else had chosen for me. I offered you a contract because I believed love was something people like me could schedule, negotiate, or postpone. You changed that. You taught me that kindness is stronger than status, that integrity is worth more than inheritance, and that home is not a place built with stone, but with the person who stands beside you every single day. Elena Whitmore, will you marry me again? This time without conditions, without deadlines, and without an ending." Tears filled Elena's eyes as she remembered the frightened stranger she had met on that snowy night, and the uncertain woman she herself had been. She gently touched the silver pendant that had led her back to her family's history before placing her hand in Declan's. "Yes," she whispered through a joyful smile. "This time I choose you for exactly who you are." As he placed a simple engagement ring on her finger, neither of them noticed the waitress watching quietly through the diner window with tears of happiness in her own eyes. The journey that had begun with an impossible proposal had never truly been about escaping an arranged future or discovering a forgotten fortune. It had always been about two ordinary hearts finding extraordinary courage to choose character over status, truth over appearances, and love over every expectation the world tried to place upon them. And for the first time in both of their lives, the future waiting ahead belonged entirely to them. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.